So tonight I'm going to give a introductory talk on a couple of exotic topics that come together in a very interesting way. I don't mean this to be a comprehensive talk on metamaterials or fractals, but what I want to do is to give you a couple of examples and a flavor of how things came together on some interesting, both scientific and innovative ideas that have happened over the last, especially the last 20 years, but also encompassing period going back to 1919. I can guarantee you'll learn some stuff tonight. I think a lot of what I'm going to show is going to be new to many of you, even though it's been around, some of it for 15, 20 years. So I hope to not sound, how shall I put it, a little blasé about it, because to me it's ancient history. I realize to you, you're probably hearing it for the first time, and I hope that you have some of the excitement that I had when I was coming up with some of this stuff early on. So I entitled this talk Weird Wireless, mainly because I like the sound of it, but it is strange. Some of the stuff that you're going to see tonight is pretty bizarre. I won't say it contradicts what you've been taught. I will say that it definitely is an extension in a very big way of what we all learned, especially going way back into grade school. But I hope you'll get something out of it, and I think you should definitely feel free to ask questions. In particular, I do want to say that I'm not going to give a lot of, how shall I put it, examples of how to implement this in ham radio, but I am going to give you an example at the end of where it can and should be implemented in ham radio. So I've set you up for it. Let's go into it and have some fun. So what I'm going to do is talk about several physical aspects that amount to very interesting technology when applied. But we need to go back to some early concepts, and there'll be a quiz at the end, just to remind you of some things that we deal with on a daily basis. And by the way, things going wrong or what happens on a daily basis here, let me get a little, there we go. Okay, so let's talk about interference. And by that, I mean constructive interference, which means what happens when you have waves and they come together, and when they beat constructively, you end up with a stronger new wave that's composed of those waves. You also get cancellation, and then you get things called side lobes. Well, this actually goes back to 1820 with Thomas Young, and you probably remember, back from grade school, perhaps, or certainly high school, Young's double slit experiment. And you're seeing it for real here. The important point is that what it's saying is that if you're able to generate two waves and they're offset, you can get gain, in this case, in the forward direction, and then you'll get nulls, and then you get side lobes, and so on. Well, that's great, but the problem is it doesn't tell you what the restrictions are that are being invoked by giving you that truism. So let me just give you that list, because it's going to be important in a minute or two. So interference happens even when separations between two slits are much less than half a wavelength. You can go and do this experiment yourself, or even simulate it in NEC and some other software. But you basically can get constructive interference when you have a generation of two waves when the slits are very much less than a half a wave apart. In fact, you can still get it happening as close as a tenth of a wave or less. Now, obviously, when you get it very close, you're basically superposing the same wave on top of itself, and you don't get gain. But you do have some gain even when you're very close with your two slits. The other thing is Young's experiment doesn't account for any interaction between slits. In modern terms, in antennas in particular, we would say it doesn't account for mutual coupling. In other words, it says there is no mutual coupling because the slits aren't close enough to worry about it. Well, it turns out that that's true, But the real question is, if you do get slits close to one another and you have a way of cutting down the mutual coupling, then you have something interesting, because with less mutual coupling, you're able to really take advantage of the fact that you are able to get slits close enough so that you do still get gain. Finally, in the Young double slit experiment, it doesn't tell you that you also get constructive interference when you have things that are either an echelon arrangement or parallel to each other in some way. So it's very instructive to understand the general idea of constructive interference and gain, but there's a lot in there in the assumptions that's hidden away that really is begging questions about what you can do and what the physical restrictions are in getting gain from constructive interference. So moving on from interference, let me go right into the heart of the matter, and I'm going to talk about metamaterials. So the definition of metamaterials is one of those almost wishy-washy definitions that goes back quite a long time. Essentially, most people define metamaterials as man-made materials with performance and characteristics that are not found in nature. That's a pretty nebulous and global definition, but if you look at virtually all things called metamaterials, you will find one common denominator, and that is it's a surface or a structure that has multiple close resonators. And when I say close, from an RF standpoint, it tends to be usually less than a quarter wave and typically less than a tenth of a wave separation. So you would say that it is basically a collection of resonators in an array where the array is very, very closely spaced in wavelength. Okay, well, if you look at the history of metamaterials, you'll see names like Veselago and Roger Walser and John Pendry and Dave Smith and a whole bunch of other folks. And of course, they've done a lot of great work, not implying that they haven't, but they didn't invent metamaterials. The inventors of metamaterials were Marconi and Franklin in 1919. They published a patent, and I'll show it to you in just a second, that did some very interesting things with reflectors and so on, and is a precursor to what we now know the full collection of things that metamaterials can do, which are things like change phases, shrink antenna sizes, shape power patterns, improve performance, act as lenses and magnify, and a variety of other things which normally aren't of interest, particularly to folks doing antennas and RF. Okay, but Marconi was there first. And Marconi, of course, was the first ham. Had a colleague named Franklin, who you've probably heard about, of the Franklin antenna. And they came up with the following patent. And what I've done is I've magnified it. It's patent 1301473 US. And what I've done is I've taken one of the figures and magnified that, and it's figure 11. And you'll see it, and it looks like a bunch of I-beams. Those I-beams are actually end-loaded dipoles, which are not touching each other. They're not galvanically touching, but they're very, very close to each other in terms of wavelengths. So those I-beams are approximately an eighth of a wave, and the separation, of course, is very small between them. It's on the order of about a 20th of a wave or less. Well, that's interesting, because what we see from a paper by Dave Smith and his crew at Duke University in 2012 is something called a metamaterial hologram. And what they've done is they've used this I-beam metamaterial, what they're calling a metamaterial, to try to produce a hologram. And that's cool, but I just want to point out that that same exact structure was used in this case for RF reflectors in 1919. And that's why I'm saying that the origin of metamaterials goes back to Marconi. Interesting side story on that I can go on later that deals with John Pendry and the Marconi company 30 years ago. But The bottom line is that if you really want to find the origin of what we now call metamaterials, the first clear case of it was by Marconi and Franklin in 1919. All right, well, let's talk about this. You saw that I-beam, and the question is, what's going on there? Well, you know, you've got this little tiny separation between the end loads adjacent of one loaded dipole to the next, and there's this transmission. And what I've done is I've modeled it for you. What I've done is 8 of these little Marconi and Franklin type I-beam metamaterial dipoles, and I put them next to each other, and I fed one of them. This is a simulation done in NEC 4. And the red dot is the feed, and the purple is the current distribution. So you can see that's interesting. The current really kind of begins at the bottom of the end load and dies at the top, but it also replicates at each one of those other little I-beam dipoles. They're not fed, they're excited, and they're excited by a very nearby process called evanescent waves. Now, evanescent waves are weird because if you take an electricity and magnetism course, they're talked about for about 30 seconds. Basically, evanescent waves are another solution to Maxwell's equations, and they're a physical one, but they only work over very short distances because they die off exponentially. So the only time you'd run into them is if you have things that are very, very close to one another, but not galvanically coupled. So this is a case where you have this so-called evanescent excitation, which we know exists, but is almost never run into, except when you use it, okay, to produce an excitation of adjacent metamaterial resonators, antennas. And what's happening is that because you have 8 of these little current distributions, in the far field, it ends up constructively adding. And what you get is, in this case, it will be 1 wavelength for the overall form factor. You end up with about 3 or 4 dB of gain. In other words, you have a 1 wavelength equivalent dipole with gain and a figure-8 pattern. Now, that's as opposed to a 1 wavelength regular dipole where you'd have like a cloverleaf pattern. You wouldn't have that much gain. So the point is that you've changed the condition by invoking this notion of having a metamaterial. And by doing so, you're having constructive interference on very small slit scales, which is producing gain. Now, this kind of activity has, as I said, has a number of names. And oops, sorry, didn't I list that? There we go. Things like artificial magnetic conductors, high impedance surfaces, band gap surfaces. In this case, a CCD antenna, which means controlled current distribution antenna. Well, guess what, folks? I mean, that antenna was invented not in the 1960s in Britain. It was invented by Marconi and Franklin in 1919 in the United States. All these are all go into the rubric because you have close-spaced resonators of being metamaterials. All right, well, you can do a lot of very interesting things with metamaterials, and I'm sure if you look them up, you'll hear all kinds of jazzy pronunciations about how they're reinventing optics and RF and so on. And that certainly to some degree is true. But the real problem with metamaterials as they stand is they tend to be very narrow band. They have moderate losses and moderate problems with efficiency. And many of them have physical construction problems. In other words, rather than having, for example, 2 loaded dipoles, one next to each other, they'll have a 3-dimensional structure next to another 3-dimensional structure. So, you know, what price do you pay in order to have some of these exotic characteristics? And the answer is probably not good bandwidth, not super great efficiency, and in many cases, it's kind of hard to make them. All right, that brings on the next puzzle piece, and that's fractal antennas. And that Jen over on the right is yours truly. And fractal antennas were invented in 1987. I'm happy someday to give it an entire fractal antenna talk, but for the sake of tonight's discussion, I'm just trying to point out that fractal antennas are being used here as resonators. And I just use this one particular kind of fractal antenna, which looks like a cross on the left, as an example that I'm going to work all the way through for you. So what is a fractal antenna? Well, as I said, it's an antenna whose shape is made from multiple scale of a structure. For example, on the one on the cross there, what happens is you have a square loop, and you put a box function there in the middle, and then you scale every time you have a line, you put another smaller box function. So you end up with a fair amount of intricacy just by having a magnified or demagnified, in this case, superposition on the overall structure. What I've done on the left is just to give you an example of what amounts to a fractal loop, not the only design that looks, not all designs look like this. I'm just giving this example and showing you in comparison what it would look like to a folded dipole, which is a structure over there on the right, just to give you a sense of size. And they have about the same bandwidth and the same gain. Now below, what I've done for you is I've shown you a simulation, and see if you can see the purple well. It's kind of hard to see. And what you'll see there is that there's two current distributions. There's two current maxima on this fractal antenna. And what that means is that the realized gain, that is the gain incorporating losses and so on, is really quite high, even though the footprint of this antenna is roughly about a little less than 1/8 of a wave by 1/8 of a wave. And the gain that you get, that is including the losses, is 1.73 dBi. A perfect dipole, for example, would have a gain of about 2.1 dBi. So this is pretty good. I mean, you know, an 1/8 wave footprint, you're getting 1.7 dBi. There's no magic here. It's happening because even though you have losses from, in this case, the length of the loop, you also have gain because you have two current maxima. And one is playing off against the other. Ultimately, if you keep on going and make them smaller and smaller and smaller, then the current maxima doesn't beat out the losses, and you get a lossy antenna. But if you're trying to shrink typically a factor of 2 to 4 times, fractals do a pretty darn good job. Now, I don't want you to take my word for it on this aspect of the gain looking good, even though you've shrunk the antenna. Here's a confirmation that was done in 2007. By the way, that loop was invented 1987, I guess. It was invented over just before New Year's and into New Year's 87, 88. So it takes a long time for people to really, how shall I put it, get past the paradigm and actually explore these things for themselves. And this is kind of interesting. It was published, as I said, a number of years ago. And what they're saying is you reduced it a factor of 2, but the gain stayed the same. The performance characteristics stayed the same. And again, the reason for that is because you have two current maxima and you're getting constructive interference, even though you have the two current maxima very close to one another. Get them too close, it won't work, but less than 1/8 of a wave, 1/10 of a wave, you're still getting a fair amount of fractions of a dB of gain increase from the current maxima beating against each other through interference. All right, so there's a whole bunch of things that fractal antennas do. There's this unfortunate comment that's going around, I don't know how else to describe it, that fractals are a loading mechanism, and because they're a loading mechanism, they make pretty little antennas, but they're lossy. And again, I just showed you what's really happening, which is you get multiple current maxima and you get constructive interference, and that is playing off against any losses you would get. So it isn't just a loading mechanism. It's a mechanism which changes the characteristics of the performance of the antenna. It can make it multiband or broadband. It, of course, can shrink the size. The other thing that's very interesting, and it's important to hear, it gives you less mutual coupling than other approaches. Finally, as I said, you know, the gains look pretty good. So between the less mutual coupling, Why is there less mutual coupling? Well, it's because it's looking like at a plate of a capacitor, making the plate smaller. Between that and the multibandedness or broadbandedness and the realized gain, these are pretty darn good resonators. Call it an antenna, call it a resonator. Essentially, now the question becomes what happens when you use them and put them very closely packed to each other as a metamaterial. So let me give you the timeline for that. And this is a very interesting story. I can look back at it and chuckle now, but it wasn't funny at the time. So in 2002, I was funded as a DARPA project. And that was back in the days when DARPA was boasting that it, was funding projects that were not likely to succeed. Maybe they still do that, I don't know. But they had a rather bad habit of funding people and then calling them fruits and nuts. So I had the fruits and nuts conversation, and I then had the conversation back. And the bottom line is, this is neither fruity, but let me tell you why they gave us that description. So what I did is I took a 3x3 panel of these little fractal loops, these fractal antennas, and I put them very close to one another and made a metamaterial. That is, the separation that you're seeing there on the right is about a 1/16 of a wavelength between each one of these crosses, and each one of the crosses is about an 1/8 of a wavelength. And we phased them up and got some interesting results. It turns out that you can get a certain amount of what is often called super gain, although the bandwidth is not all that narrow, meaning you pick up 3 or 4 dB more than you'd expect from the typical size of the aperture, illuminating it, say, with loaded dipoles. That's very interesting. But there's another thing that's really interesting here. And if you look over on the left, you'll see what I'm talking about. So the main beam's a little offset from 180 on this polar plot here. But you can see there's a main beam. It's at about 170. We had some rotation when we did those initial measurements. But you'll see there's two things that look like side lobes. And I pointed them out in the yellow dots. And what those amount to is emission from the edges. In other words, on this planar sheet, there's emission coming almost to the same intensity off on the sides than there is broadside. That's really bizarre. And because these are at 90 degrees away, they are not side lobes. They have nothing to do with truncation of the aperture. They have nothing to do with spacing of the elements on the aperture. They are something else. And here's what they are, or rather what they're not. They're not grating lobes. There's nothing there that produces grating lobes at that angle. They're not something called creeping wave, which is a diffraction. And boy, I had to go through that for a number of years. Sorry, it just isn't creeping wave. If you do more experiments, you find out there's nothing that has the characteristics of diffraction. One of the interesting things, especially with radar people, is they didn't want to discuss this. They looked at it as a real occasional problem they ran into with close-spaced dipoles, but they didn't want to go into it, which said to me they looked at it as an error condition, and one doesn't talk about one's failures. Okay, well, I was interested. I couldn't get the DARPA folks interested. They thought that I just made the measurements wrong. So we made the measurements again. We started from scratch. And we said, no, there's something very interesting happening here. And we know there's going to be evanescent waves. So what we think is they are surface waves. So let me talk about that. So surface waves are electromagnetic waves that are confined to a surface. And they're re-radiated as traveling waves at discontinuities, that is, at boundary conditions, at edges, for example. They're caused by a differential dielectric at a metal surface. They're usually trivial. But if you end up having low mutual coupling, small resonators, which are very close to one another, and in addition, a reasonably broad band, you're going to see this surface wave effect caused by evanescence. So what I've done on the bottom is I've shown you an example of what happens if you have a whole bunch of point-like resonators. This is from modeling. With their current distributions, you'll generate this overall surface wave, and it comes off, in this case, showing on the arrow on the right. So we know these things exist. What's happening is that we're driving them to a very large intensity that you don't normally see. Going back, you'll see that those dots on the left are almost the same intensity as the gain of the main lobe. That's pretty amazing. Okay, well, I have one of these weird minds where I like to make strange connections and play what if. So I said, what if we took this panel and made it much, much larger? And rather than just making it a square, a plane, why don't we make it a loop? Why don't we make it a manifold so it goes back on itself? What would happen then? And I did the thought experiment and I realized that you would have the edges now generating a surface wave that would come back on the exact opposite side. So you'd have basically an ability to propagate a wave across that manifold surface that came out on the other side. So you'd end up with basically a main lobe and a back lobe, but the back lobe would be happening because you're going around on the manifold. It wouldn't be caused by the radiation of the back of the feed system or anything like that. So I worked this out and then I said, well, that's very interesting because now you have a mechanism for getting what's called front scatter or forward scatter. So what if instead of making this an antenna, we've made it an object that you're hitting with a radar? If you did that, then you'd have a lot of forward scatter, which is really bizarre. But you'd also have a way of getting rid of the back scatter, which is the front reflection. And the way that would happen is you'd have out of phase components. The wave would be coming in, bounce, and go back and be out of phase with the rest of the incoming waves. So you'd get phase cancellation bouncing back and a bunch of radiation coming out as front scatter. Well, that has a name, and it's called a cloak. So between 2003 and 2008, I did some experiments and convinced myself this was going to work, but I also had an ethical issue, which sometimes happens with inventors, with what the heck am I going to do with this? Because if you invent a cloak, then you have an interesting mechanism for making things disappear. And the real question then becomes, what's the countermeasure for that? So it took me a number of years to understand, was there a countermeasure for something that, say, cloaked at a 7 or 8 or 10 to 1 bandwidth? And the answer is there is. Not going to go into that tonight, but that's why I took so much time before I moved forward on it, because I had a huge ethical issue as to whether I wanted to let the information out. Well, it turns out other people were working on it at the same time. And although I did it first and got the patents, it really does become an ethical issue, which is when do you pursue something and when don't you pursue something? And again, my feeling was as soon as I understood that there could be a way of getting around it, I felt much better about pushing it forward. Well, anyway, the point is that if you take these loops, which are made, you can see them, these little fractal resonators right next to each other. What you can do is you can get a lot of front scatter. That is, you can make radiation come out the other side, but you don't see any radiation coming back. And not only that, but with these fractals, because the resonators are broadband and multiband, you end up having a wideband invisibility cloak, which is something people had not anticipated. So let me show you a little more about that. This is just the very first one that I showed people. And what I did is I made it basically two-dimensional. Well, the way to really move ahead on something like this is you want to go and do the obvious, which is cloak a person. Did you know that a person was cloaked? Did you know that a person was cloaked in 2012? Well, that's when it happened. What we did is we built a huge cylinder of these manifolds, and we stuck an intern in the middle of it. Interns are, we just tell them to do things and they do it. So intern's name is Peter, real nice guy, now a very successful electrical engineer. And I'm going to show you the data on it. So let me make this simple. Basically, what it's saying is you have two antennas. They're roughly about 20 feet away from each other, and then something in the middle. When Peter's in the middle, what you're getting is that Peter is acting like a door, meaning he's an obstruction and he's cutting down the intensity between the two antennas. In other words, one antenna is not seeing the full intensity as if there was nothing there. So the dotted line is the normalization or the 0 point of the intensity over a large passband, in this case 3:1, is if there was nothing in between the two antennas. And then we had Peter walk between the two antennas, and you get that solid line. So, you know, he's a pretty good door as it amounts to over at least a 2:1, even a 3:1 passband. You can see that typically the intensity goes down 10 to 15 dB when he stands in front. Okay, so keep in mind Peter's still standing in front. And then we put this cylinder, this huge cylindrical object on top of him. And he doesn't move a muscle. We literally just put it on top, and you get the following data. So what you've seen is that the two antennas are now acting as there's nothing in between them. It's all transparent. Now, Peter's still there. He's still an obstruction, but the waves are going around the manifolds on the cylinder and coming out the other side. And you can see that in this example, we're getting really good results for cloaking Peter over at least a 2:1 passband. Now, since that time, we've been able to get passbands on the order of 10:1. But the point is that this, I'm sure, sounds like new stuff to most of you. And it was cool then. I still think it's cool now. The first person, the Invisible Man, happened back in 2012. I wish I could see your faces. I see you all sitting there, but I can't look at your faces. It would be more fun to have you now, you know, see this data back when I saw it and feel, and I'm sure in some ways you feel the same way. Pretty amazing, fun stuff. Okay, well, 1,500 people have seen cloak demos at this point. And this big picture you are seeing was done at the IEEE Phased Array Conference many years back, 2013. And what we did is we we took part of an oak tree and cloaked the trunk. And I wanted people to think about what other kind of objects would have that kind of, how shall I put it, circumference. And of course it worked, and it was fun. You'll notice that there's a mail truck in the background. The mailman figured out that something interesting was happening, and he actually came and watched the cloaking demonstration. So I had the US government on site watching the cloaking demonstration. Lots of fun stuff. Okay, well, that's an example where you can take these effects caused by the fractal metamaterials, which the advantage is their bandwidth, they are efficient, and there's less mutual coupling. And now we can explore the possibilities. So I'm going to talk about a new kind of antenna that is related, but in some ways is better than Yagi's. Let's back up just for a second. So here we go. So here's this fractal metamaterial, which is just on a square. It's planar. And what I said is, let's make it a loop and do this to it. So it's a bit of a round circular loop. Now I want you to think about what happens if you take that loop and you squash it down. So it's very thin. It has a very large aspect ratio, and it has two edges. And what happens if you excite it at that edge? By the way, in this picture here, we just put the log periodics close by to show that they existed. When we actually made the measurements of the cloaks, they were much farther away. But let's do that. Let's take this structure, bunch of fractal metamaterial loops, and let's make this structure out of it. In other words, we're going to make a very squashed loop feed it from an edge with a dipole, and ask what happens. Well, just to back up, let me remind you that Yagis operate on similar principles. What they do is they have lens-like characteristics because the directors end up being excited and out of phase with the driven element, but the out of phase aspect ends up constructive interference, and you end up with gain. Obviously, on the reflected element, if there is one, that also contributes. But the point is, it is interference. Our old friend here that's come in a very interesting variation. Now, by the way, the problem with Yagi-Uda antennas is that you can't get the elements very close to one another. I mean, if you do, you can broaden bandwidth, but they don't contribute to the gain. And the reason is because you have a lot of mutual coupling between elements. So if you have a way of decreasing the mutual coupling and increasing the bandwidth, you have an ability to do a new kind of directional parasitic antenna. It's not really a Yagi-Uda. It's something entirely different. Let me show you an example. So what we've done is we've taken that edge, as I said, and we put it next to a dipole. And in back of the dipole, you can see it on the right, is a little reflector. And we stuck this manifold, I call it a card because it looks like a card, in front. And the point is, what do you get? Well, you get this. First of all, here's the dipole itself. The 0 line indicates it's normalized. So that's 0 dBd. The red line is the SWR. It's not gain, it's SWR. So the bottom is 1-to-1, and then going up, it's 2-to-1, 3-to-1, and so on. And then when you put this whole ensemble together with the dipole, you end up with this. You end up with 13 dBd, 13 dB of gain, and a fairly nice bandwidth. Looks pretty good. It doesn't get narrow. I'll flick it for you here. It does change the SWR somewhat. It does shift it, not by much. And this is, what is this? It's 1.5 to 2.5 gigs, by the way. But you can see how, look at the purple line. Here you have just the dipole itself. Here is that weird looking antenna that has a regular reflector, but one of these fractal metamaterial cards loops in front of it. And you can see how much the gain has gone up. All right, what does that look like? Well, here's the power pattern, by the way, and sure enough, it looks kind of like a Yagi. It looks like this. What I've done is I've superposed the antenna I'm just describing that's made from these fractal metamaterials against a regular Yagi-Uda of the same gain. So you get a sense of the relative form factor differences. Pretty dramatic. Now, if you go back to the boom length for a given gain for a Yagi-Uda antenna and compare that to the length of one of these fractal metamaterial antennas, you can see the fractal metamaterial is an X on this scale, and the dotted line here, sorry, the solid blue line indicates what you get for a typical NBS style Yagi. So it's really off the chart compared to a normal NBS Yagi, or NIST Yagi as it were. And here's an example of what it looks like. What I've done is I've superposed how it would look on a tower. And on the right here, you see what it actually looks like. You can see the dipole, and you can see that card in front, and in back, there's a reflector. So the card itself, by the way, is giving you about 6 dB of gain. So there is some gain from the reflector, as you would expect, but the fractal metamaterial itself is giving you about 6 dB. So, oops. So these are two of the best examples that I could think of to show this weird combination of metamaterials and fractals, and how you can explore a whole regime of new applied applications. In one case, the cloak, in another case, not reinventing Yagis, but really extending that family in a very interesting way. So I'm going to end by giving you one example that can be used in ham radio. I get asked all the time if I can give an example of a 160-meter fractal antenna that will fit into someone's bathtub. And, you know, no, it doesn't exist. I've never claimed it existed. If you make antennas so they're very, very electrically small, very small with respect to a wavelength, they all are lousy. All of them are poor. But the bottom line is that you can use the fractals to shrink some of the sizes. But there's one thing you can do with these fractal metamaterials that you can't necessarily do in other ways. And that is you can increase the performance going off towards the horizon by taking advantage of this evanescent edge effect. And what I have here is a very small S-band antenna. It's a loaded monopole. You can see the top cap. And you'll see that the bottom is comprised of two parts. It's a small ground plane. It's only about 1/5 of a wave in size. And then you've got these, little fractal loops as a metamaterial. And what's happening is that if you just measure the gain of this antenna with the regular small footprint of the ground plane there, you measure a certain value, it's not very good. As soon as you put these, in this case, 4 resonators on top of it, you end up with a 4 dB increase. So what that tells you is that there are certainly applications where if you take advantage of the ground by putting fractal resonators in a metamaterial configuration, you're going to increase performance at the horizon. I think this is definitely, I know for a fact that it's applicable on HF bands because I've done it. The problem is I'm not going to define for someone whether or not they should build these things by, by taking nails and putting them on a piece of plywood and building a jig and then sticking them on the ground. That's for other people to explore. But my point is that it can be explored, it can be used, it has been used. It's one of the things that I've been doing in my small suburban lot to have very good performance on a number of HF bands. And I'm hoping that some of this talk tonight will get a number of you thinking, and we can get some interesting experiments done over the next 2 or 3 years. So I'm going to leave it at that. I've gone a little long. I'm happy to take questions, and I'm going to turn it back over to you folks. Am I still on there, Logan? There we go.
Okay. Okay, if there are questions, I want you to talk into the microphone here. No questions?
Well done, Chip. Well done. And
thank you very much.
Chip, thank you for joining us. And for those of you who may not remember, Chip was the 2018 Dayton Hamvention Technical Achievement Award winner. So since then, I've gotten to know Chip personally, great guy. Really appreciate you coming and joining us this evening, and looking forward to seeing you in May. Enjoy the holidays, be safe. Peace out.
Thank you.